Predators are like jellyfish. They scare the hell out of me for no good reason. So I would just as soon not think about jellyfish, and I would just as soon not think about predators. And at this stage of the game, they're kind of uninteresting. My stance for a long time has been counter to the prevailing theory. So in many cases, and you can see people write about this today, because a drone is unmanned does not mean it is invisible. So I see it all the time. Well, we're going to use predators to shoot SA-10s. Are you kidding me? What, are they invisible? I mean, how are they going to find them? They're like the Russians are going to let them saunter up? Except that the Russians have let drones saunter up to air defense systems and plink them. So for decades, for easily 20 years, you're not going to get a unmanned remote control drone in on a air defense system, and the Ukrainians do it almost every day. Okay, so it's not that I'm uninterested in the Predator and Reaper so much as it is that I'm completely uninterested in the Predator and the Reaper. That is old, traditional. That's like the traditional drone, and I don't care about it anymore. Not that they're not useful. I just don't care.
Starbaby, welcome back to 10% True. Good to see you again.
Thanks. Great to be here.
You're looking really good, by the way. I think we said this before I hit record, but I need to say it again. You're looking very sharp.
It was an accident.
So not of your doing or your choosing.
Not of my. Definitely not of my doing. This involves like grooming and stuff, and that's if you see it, it's not of my doing.
Hey, we're going to do a standalone episode today, which for anybody listening at home thinking, well, what does a standalone episode mean? It is the fact that you and I regularly go through sort of 2 or 3 part recordings where we record over a period of time. F4G as an example, does F15E in the Balkans as another example where we do a series of episodes that connect together. This is probably just going to be a standalone episode, so it will just sit on its own. But I should say, for the audience's benefit, you have a lot of Starbaby coming up over the next 3 or 4 months. So Starbaby, do you know when we recorded part 1 of your ground tour series?
I know that we did. I don't know when.
It was a year ago.
I don't even remember what I said.
So I'm going to have to send it to you. But so we recorded that a year ago. So we're going to do a Starbaby ground tour series, which is going to be 2 parts. The first part was recorded a year ago. The next part we'll record in the next few weeks, 4 or so weeks. But after that, there will also then be a light attack series, which kind of ties into the ground tour. Will involve us bringing back Hanky Cunningham, who was the F-14D Rio, who was also involved in light attack type work, and he mentioned his OV-10 experience in that interview. If you haven't seen it at home, go back and find it and listen to it. It's a fantastic episode. And then we will culminate that with, so there'll be 2 interviews. There'll be one with Starbaby about light attack on his own. There'll be one with Hanky about light attack on his own. And then the 2 guys will come back, Hanky and Starbaby at the same time, and we'll have a 3rd part on light attack. So that's, I think, including this, 6 Starbaby episodes for you at home to listen to and enjoy. Look forward to. So the only ask, as I always say, is that you like and subscribe to the channel. I am selling my books on the 10percenttrue.com website, and seriously, if you buy those, it helps me a lot. It helps to keep the channel going, makes it much easier for me to do more and spend more time doing a better job of doing more. So it's not just me asking you because I want you to make me wealthy. It makes a big difference. If you feel like supporting the channel, the very best way to do that is go to 10percenttrue.com. Maybe pick up a polo shirt like the one I'm wearing, or ideally buy a book or buy an advanced copy of a book. So I'm selling books that I'm going to be publishing over the course of the next year or so. Right, Starbaby. I think I just droned on.
No, that was fine.
That was my terrible joke for the subject matter of this episode. Drones.
Oh, it's too bad I didn't get it.
So we were talking on the phone the other day. We don't talk that often on the phone. I don't want to think that you and I are always, calling each other up and chatting. But we were talking on the phone the other day about some of the stuff that's coming up, and I talked to you a little bit about the drones that were appearing at the back end of last year here in the UK, RAF Lakenheath, RAF Marham, and I'd asked your thoughts on them. And that turned into a slightly bigger conversation around drones and UAPs. And then I said to you, well, you know what? It would be great to do an episode where you give us your opinion on drone warfare and the future of drone warfare and so on and so forth. And you said, well, actually, that's kind of interesting because I'm putting together a class for that because you teach. It's up to you how much you tell the audience about that, or if you tell the audience about that at all. So those two things sort of coincide, and so therefore we just agreed that we would do this episode as a one-off. So before I let you give us your view, because I know you have a starting point for this conversation, which you told me about, and I said, "What's that?" And you were very kind to me and didn't give me a hard time for not knowing about it. But before we get to that, tell us a little bit about your assessment of those drones that were being observed and witnessed over RAF Lakenheath here in the UK at the back end of last year. What was that all about?
I do not have enough data to give a good assessment. I mean, the facts of what we do know is we know that there were drones flying inside Lakenheath's control zone, Mildenhall's control zone, over Royal Air Force Feltwell, and I saw other open source reports that suggested those weren't the only bases. They were lighted, okay, which means that whoever was flying them was either needed to see them or just felt like complying with the Civil Aviation Authority's rules. And that last doesn't seem likely because they were violating them with the where they're flying. So I don't know whether they were electric. I don't know if they were gasoline powered. I have no good ideas on who did it or why. But we do know that they interfered with flight operations because the Air Force released that data and said, look, we had to divert a KC-46 because we had drones in our airspace. And as we just saw this week with the fires over Los Angeles, a professional photographer drone, a guy who violated the temporary restriction area rules, smacked into a water tanker and grounded that aircraft when they needed it the most. So what we know is somebody who was deliberately violating the rules about flying near airfields. We don't know the who and we don't know the why. And to some extent, we don't know to a great deal the what.
Can you expound a little then on why? I mean, so I say expound a little as though you're an insider, and you're not an insider. You're using open source methods. You're not doing anything sketchy to find out about this stuff. But can you expand a little bit on why it seemed like over here, at least, the MOD, the RAF police are responsible for looking after RAF Lakenheath. I'm guessing the Air Force has its own security forces guys that are there to, protect the airspace and protect the facility. How is it that they seemed so slow to be able to identify who was doing it, what was doing it? I mean, so certainly from my point of view, we had a massive storm that came in. 50, 60 mile an hour winds. And I think as soon as that hit, I don't live that far from Lakenheath, so I'm in the same sort of weather system. As soon as that hit, it all kind of went away. But up until that point, it seemed like we were floundering. And certainly the press was saying the SAS had been brought in to use advanced methods to try and, figure out what was going on and who was doing what. From your point of view, do you have any insight as to why they weren't much more able to identify who was doing what and what it was all about?
So I don't have any more insight. I have semi-informed speculation. So what we're dealing with is something that the NATO militaries have been slow to react to, and the United States and the United Kingdom are no exception to this. You're looking at drones as a possible threat, as a possible adversary collection tool, and it's not as simple as just shooting them down. So in the day, Cold War, batteries of air defenses around air bases, we expected Cold War, if it went hot, that anything that came near an air base that didn't meet the appropriate criteria for not shooting at, we would shoot at. And that's how base air defense was built. There was no real expectation that we would have to deal with an hostile actor using civilian tools under peacetime conditions. Now, that did happen, and the Soviets had the same problem. So if you remember, and for those that don't remember, you can look it up. It's Matthias Rust, spelled R-U-S-T, flew a rented Cessna 172 and landed it just off Red Square. And so that, and of course, you've got Korean Airlines 007, which was shot down by the Soviets over the east. There's a lesser-known event where an Israeli aircraft was shot down by an SA-5 over the Black Sea. The peacetime air defense structure was not well structured to handle those kind of threats, which is one of the reasons why it seemed to take so long for the U.S. to respond to a domestic flight threat with commercial airliners in 2001. So this is not a normal Department of Defense, Ministry of Defense challenge. This is more correctly a law enforcement and civil aviation authority challenge. And I don't know of any Western country where the civil aviation authority, in our case, it's the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, who has authority to intercept and shoot down drones when it's flying over the top of somebody's house. I actually don't know the answer to that question. In the U.S., you'd think, well, North American Air Defense has that authority. And then do they actually have that authority? How many hoops do they have to jump through? How much coordination has to happen? How much collateral damage assessment has to happen? And do you even have the effectors in place? And any break in that chain means that you're standing around looking like a bunch of Keystone cops, when in reality, you have a bunch of people who know what their solution is, know the limits of their authority, and can't act because they've gone as far as they're allowed. So with any law enforcement kind of issue, any kind of new crime, and this might as well be a new crime, and there's always a lag in trying to figure out how to deal with it. And so it looks like it's a clown act, but I think it's more we're reacting to an unforeseen situation. And it's a cross between, is this a military air defense need? Is this a law enforcement issue? We know now that the regulatory environment is simply not good enough. I mean, the regulatory environment in the U.S., for example, and I'm familiar with the British one too, on drones, is, if you violate these rules, we're going to fine you up to $75,000. Well, that's great, but we have to know who you are. Well, we want to know who you are. You have to fly a drone ID on your drone. Well, what if I didn't? Well, then you're a bad, bad person. That's not an effective, deterrent, and it's not an effective counter. So what I think we're looking at is something that consistently people have been unwilling to put the bureaucracy together to deal with. Because in the U.S., we have other examples. Nobody's ever heard of Picatinny Arsenal except people who live in northern New Jersey. Great place, super cool. They do great things in derelict buildings that date from the Second World War. They used to build gun barrels. I mean, they have amazing stuff. If you're into Second World War era and follow-on industry, which I didn't think I was until I got a tour, they don't actually have airspace over the top of them. And they had a bunch of controlled airspace. They had a bunch of drones flying around. What are these guys doing? They're actually not breaking the rules in terms of airspace, but it's a U.S. military installation. The flights over Langley Air Force Base last year have now been well publicized, and that did interfere with operations. So I think we're seeing an emerging kind of, I don't know how to put it. I don't want to call it a rogue activity, but airborne disorderly conduct with people who have new toys. That we should not rule out, and I'm always prepared to blame the Russians for anything that looks like an intelligence collection or a disruption operation or gray zone ops or reflexive control. I can use all of those terms, but the bottom line is I'm fully prepared to blame the Russians for some of this, because odds are good that they're responsible for some of this.
Mm. Do you? So you mentioned New Jersey, and I think at a similar time so that was at the back end of last year. There were some videos that came out from Florida, one of the bases in Florida. Was it maybe Tyndall? I can't remember, but there was some video, and I think that the video was a year old or so, and it showed a sort of line of lights out over Tyndall and similar sort of thing to what was being seen over New Jersey. Now I know that that some of the news media had video of 737s and stuff going into New Jersey and said, "Oh, it's a drone," and clearly it wasn't. So I know that some people got some things wrong. But it sounds like you do think that there may have been some credible sightings or some credible identification of drone activity in that airspace.
Yes, I think there was. And that's basically, I hate to say this, I'm kind of reliant on the state police, who got really fired up about this. Although the state police said some, things. It's like, well, they're not using a signal that we can detect. And it's like, okay, great. Do you have a spectrum analyzer on the problem? Or, what are we talking about? So if it were a one-off report, I would be inclined to dismiss it as mistaken identity or somebody who made a mistake. When you start collecting reports, I tend to assess it more credibility. I could be wrong. It could be just additional hysteria. One person reports Bigfoot, and the next thing you know, somebody's having tea with Bigfoot in their back garden.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to just say to you, I think it's well known to people who have listened to the channel long enough that I don't really do any prep for interviews, and sometimes that catches me out. Most of the time, it doesn't. It's okay. And tonight I've not even been drinking. It's Sunday night. I'm doing the kids drop off at school tomorrow, so I definitely can't have anything to drink. So I'm very sober and taking this as seriously as I can do. But when I was thinking about it today, I was thinking I don't really know how. I mean, you always do all the talking in these things, which is as it should be. People are here to listen to you, but I need to prompt and sometimes get things going. And I know you've got a narrative, and you've in terms of you've done some analysis, you've prepared this class, so you've got a starting point, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this. But before you get to that, I did want to ask a little bit about the stratification of drones, in terms of the seriousness, the potential capabilities of them. So it sounds as though Lake and Heath may have been sort of some commercial off-the-shelf type drones, maybe hobbyist drones, maybe something a bit more serious, being employed for whatever reasons. Then there are the drones that I think sometimes, I don't know if you could call them drones, but they're the UAPs, the unidentified aerial phenomenon, which are, sometimes you're hearing, especially these days, military pilots saying and military aircrew saying they've observed and they've witnessed and sometimes they've even interacted with. When I say to you, let's do an episode on drones and drone warfare and that kind of stuff, do you exclude UAPs? Are you, in your analysis and your approach to analyzing these things, are you stratifying and saying, well, there may be very advanced threat actor owned UAP type things that don't resemble, a quadcopter, that are using some advanced tech, and that's one thing? But I'm not really looking at that. Or are you looking at everything holistically and sort of assessing it based on it being an ensemble of things?
By definition, I'm excluding unidentified things. So the U in UAP, unidentified, pretty much means we don't know what it is. And so it, in my mind, it gets excluded, not because it's not something that is potentially interesting. It is something that is extremely low on data. And so that means, what kind of conclusions can I draw from no data? I can speculate. I could always say aliens. I could always say Chinese. I could reflexively blame the Russians. I could do all of that, but that's farther away from actual data than I prefer to go. So most of what I do is, most of my research is, I'm looking at, as much as I hate to say this, because I tell you, I'm not on social media. I'm all over social media, but purely in a passive mode. Social media, one of the really neat things about it, and is that it allows you to do intelligence gathering from a distance. But you have to understand the limitations of what's being presented to you. And everything on social media is being presented to you by somebody with an agenda. And so, like any other thing, and I was just discussing this morning, talking about Allied force, 25 plus years ago, and what you think about Allied force is often very dependent on where you sat and what you observed, because efforts to collect the big picture tend to be small. They tend to be limited distribution. They hide behind classification. That's all legit, by the way. But the Air Force, for example, we used to have Project Chico back in Vietnam. Tons of reports. You've read Project Red Baron because that fed into earlier research. These are all actual research things that we could point to and say, this is the data we collected. That went away with the peace dividend. And so when you see that kind of project, it tends to be rat-holed inside a community that doesn't want to share with anybody else, and it doesn't affect like the decision ecosphere, and it's hard to get to trickle out. So that's a long way of saying that UAPs are too far away from a basis that I could footnote, really, in order to include them in my analysis. And as much as I try not to be a bullshit artist.
I think that's something that anybody who's ever listened to you on this channel would have no issue with. I mean, I think that's you're always unequivocal about sort of what you're saying and what you don't know. So I don't think that's
right. There are plenty of Russian bots who think I'm a bullshit artist, but that's cool.
Yeah, well, you're going to get that anytime, aren't you? So, okay. So tell us a bit then about your research. So I started this conversation by saying that you had said to me, well, my starting point was this conflict. And I said to you, well, where's that? When was that? And, you were, as I said, you were kind enough not to give me shit for not knowing the answer. But is that where your research started? And if so, tell us about the evolution.
That's an unexpected question. Okay, so when I was in the Weasel Squadron at Nellis, Nellis stood up, reactivated the 11th Recon Squadron. And the 11th Reconnaissance Squadron was the first Air Force Predator Squadron, which was the first UAV squadron, really, that wasn't an aerial target squadron since just after the Vietnam War. And so I got interested, but not interested enough to volunteer to be in a squadron where people weren't flying fighters, right? So let's just say that I knew people in it, and that's kind of where I started. And, I knew a little bit about the drones that were used in Allied Force because they were both fast and slow drones. We obviously had challenges in Allied Force because the drones were unarmed. And so there was a lot of frustration in that this was the first time that somebody in an air operations center could look at a drone picture and actually see a target, couldn't engage it, couldn't necessarily talk anybody onto it. By the way, that's not something that an air operations center should be doing or should have been doing then, should be doing now, should be doing ever. Their operational level of war. But what you ended up with, from my vantage point, was the introduction of crack cocaine into the air operations center, and that was the Predator. And I didn't coin that term. Predator crack has been a term for 20 years. Okay, and it's where, and I've seen it happen because I was an instructor at KOC-N, which was the training KOC in Nellis, involuntarily, I might add. I was asked by a bunch of really good guys, hey, you want to be an instructor at KOC-N as we stand it up? And I said, no. And the next thing I know, I'm one of the instructors at KOC-N, which was actually great because that was during a Pentagon assignment. And that meant that I got to go out to Nellis and kind of rehack my clock. I got to participate in training events. I got to teach people how to do time-sensitive targeting because really the part that I'm teaching on is managing a combat operations floor in terms of time-sensitive targeting. But I could see it. I could put up maps on any one of a number of screens. We can put up maps. We can put up milestones. We can put up, this is the sequence of events. We can put up intelligence information. But the moment I put Predator crack on the screen, The whole floor's productivity goes to hell, and they focus on the wrong thing. So that was kind of my exposure. And of course, I left the Air Force to avoid a Prowler assignment at the end of 1999, went into the Guard, 113th Wing, 121st Fighter Squadron, and then got an opportunity to go into Checkmate and then onto the Skunks as a reservist. And one of the first things that I started doing in 2000 was I started looking at the history of drones in the U.S. Air Force. And this was fascinating. And I wasn't the only one doing this at the time. But you go back to Vietnam because I knew about the Firebee drones, like the Buffalo Hunters, because they had been used for reconnaissance on the Son Tay raid, which was a raid to free prisoners of war. There's a book by Benjamin Schemler, if you can find it, called The Raid, which is amazing. I have a copy, and you can pry it out of my cold, dead hands because it's hard to find. But so I knew the pieces and parts, and I started putting them together. And looking at, there were dozens of different models of Firebee drones used in combat, not only in Vietnam, but over China and over North Korea in the 60s and 70s. They did amazing stuff. Some of them had radar warning gear. Some of them had ELINT detectors. Some of them were remote controlled. A great number of them were autonomous. They did wet film, for God's sake, but there were also ones with live video streams.
Really?
Yes. And, my favorite is one that had a radar warning gear in it. So that when it was lit up by an SA-2, it made a 90-degree turn to the right. That's it. And the survivability of those drones was higher than identical drones without that mod.
Wow.
So that led us up to, believe it or not, a program called Have Lemon. And Have Lemon was a program that I think ended about 1974 to take drones and put weapons on them. And they were Maverick and they were Paveway, laser-guided bombs on these drones. And as I looked at the test from a distance, they seemed, well, this kind of worked. But the problem was that a squadron of drones that could do that cost as much as an entire wing of A-10s. And so Have Lemon terminated, and it went away until the Predator shows up as a derivative, really, of the Nat 750 in 1995. Now, there are plenty of folks that know more about this than I do, and someday they will tell their stories. But that, to my mindset, there's a big gap in the 90s that doesn't pick up until, Allied force, and then, monitoring, before and after that time frame, where we were using things to monitor the post-Dayton Accords, the Dayton Accords over Bosnia. So that puts us in the 95 to 99 time frame. And then shortly after that, we started arming Predators to kind of fill the gaps that were highlighted by Allied force and general officers not being able to kill tanks, which is not their job.
Yep.
So
let me stop you there. Just for a second, just interrupt your flow and just go back to some of the things that you've just mentioned. Then, so I knew about the Firebees. I knew about them flying over North Korea and China and Soviet Russia and so on. My memory, and you're not presenting yourself as a SME, as a Predator SME here, but so I'm maybe asking the wrong person. But my memory of Predator was that it was General Atomics that had the idea of this thing and presented it to the military. At least that's my understanding of it, rather than the military going out, putting a competition out there and saying, okay, a request for proposals, request for whatever. So General Atomics just said, hey, we could build this thing, and here, what do you think of it? That's my memory of it. So it could be wrong. But
no, that's my memory of it too.
Okay, so what about the period in between then? So Have Lemon doesn't go anywhere because it's too expensive. You have this period where there's a blank effectively. Is it possible that Lemon just went underground, just became black, that they developed some drones out of that, and that part of the Air Force's history has not yet been declassified? Or do you think it just satellite imagery was good enough that they didn't need the drones anymore and other collection assets were more capable?
No, so I mean, totally different time frame, right? So when Have Lemon went away, satellites were still a thing. Plus, we still had the U2, we still do, and the SR-71. So that's decades before satellites will become the be all and end all of technical reconnaissance.
Okay.
I think that went away, and the reason I think it went away, as opposed to going black, is because when the Predator reemerged, the technology to do things like point the ball in the right place based on your inertial navigation system, to have small enough GPS receivers, that technology did not exist.
Okay.
So that kind of suggests to my mind that it did not go black because there were no subsequent technological spinouts that would have made Predator easier than it was.
Okay.
The other thing I want to bring out, and this is, so when you're out of Phantoms, you're out of fighters. And you've heard me say it, but this is another case where I think that's true. So in the Gulf War, Air Force RF-4Cs and Marine Corps RF-4Bs were fast jet recon assets. And they hung around for a couple of years, but the Air Force got rid of them. So by the time the former Yugoslavia breaks up and you have a need for real-time overflight reconnaissance, the fast jets have been retired with no replacement. And the SR-71 was retired weeks before Desert Storm kicked off because satellites could do everything. Well, obviously, satellites couldn't do everything. And, nothing more than cloud cover, which an RF-4 could fly under, and a satellite can't fly under. Well, not for long. Those were gaps. And so the Germans had RF-4Es, but by the mid-90s, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. And we were unlikely to see, and I don't think we ever saw, Spanish or anybody else's RF-4Es over Bosnia. So, and it's not, one of the things the RF-4 could only do is it was a snapshot in time. It was pre-strike, it was post-strike, it was a reconnaissance run. What we really needed was eyeballs on target. And that video stream, because you needed not to assess whether or not, how many Russian bombers were parked on a North Vietnamese airfield. You needed to know whether guys were carrying weapons canisters in and out of an area where they'd been stored. And that meant that you basically needed, and I'll get right back to law enforcement, you needed to be able to do an airborne stakeout. And we had nothing that could do an airborne stakeout. In Vietnam, during the daytime, you might have done that with a FAC.
Yeah.
And so it'd be an interesting question to ask Bat, right? Did he do anything that was like an airborne stakeout? Or, any of the other guys that we've got on with OV-10 time, but particularly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Did he go just as the eyeball? So that's where we ended up with missing capabilities in the mid-90s.
Okay. So the arrival on scene then of the Predator and Predator crack, you were flying Strike Eagles at that time.
I switched to the Strike Eagle in 96.
In 96, okay. So you were there for it. So did you say you were in the KOC?
Oh, well, yes, I have been in the KOC. And I was in the KOC immediately prior to Allied Force because we sent guys down for a week to be the liaison.
Okay.
And Dodger and I were smart enough to volunteer to do a week when there was no combat going on. So we could say, sorry, man, already been, let somebody else have a go.
But was the arrival then of Predator revolutionary in the sense that it gave you that eyeball, that ability to do the airborne stakeout? Because again, my understanding of the whole sort of Balkans conflicts was that weather was a huge factor. JDAM came out of the requirement for JDAM, I think, came out of those conflicts. You guys flying Strike Eagles having to get below the weather. I think you've talked about popping out of a cloud, a supersonic, and dropping a GBU-10 or 2 on something. I mean, so that was a big issue. So did Predator solve the problem that you're talking about?
it gave us a tool that we hadn't had for a long time. And the other thing, of course, is that our previous tools would have been restricted to day only. So the Predator gave us a capability to put eyes on and do the stakeout at night.
Okay.
And so it not to disparage it, as much as I feared the whole Predator program, I feared it. Every fighter aviator feared it the moment they started involuntarily assigning guys from fighters to fly Predators. There's a song about it. Gringos does it. I shot down a Predator, as a matter of fact. So there's my plug for a pair of fighter aviators in a band. But we feared it. But it was still a useful capability that to some extent was oversold. Like any other new toy the Air Force gets, automatically it's going to be oversold. Because the Air Force culturally is all about the tech. And just having tech, I must have technology. It's a question of, it's almost like it's acquisitive versus inquisitive. As long as I can acquire the tech, it doesn't matter what the tech does. I have technology. It's like having candy, right? The more candy you have, the happier you are, regardless of whether or not you eat it. My daughter, for example, doesn't eat her Halloween candy, but she acquires it. And then she complains because I will eat 9-month-old candy the following July so that I can empty out the bowls before she hits a new Halloween. That's the way I think the Air Force behaves with technology. So it was still useful, but it was expensive. And it was expensive not because flying an airplane made of surfboard parts with a lawnmower engine bolted on the back is inherently expensive. It was expensive because it took a lot of people to turn that into a useful capability. And when their collection tool was video, that means somebody has to be watching the video all the time. An RF-4 would fly over, take a bunch of photos, you'd go back, land, develop the photos, and you could pass them every which way, make copies of them, etc. This you had to watch, and you had to have somebody who hadn't fallen asleep, who knew what they were looking at, and you had to go through the whole dissemination process of the video. That's why drones ended up... we will still pitch them as cheap, but they are not cheap. When you look at the huge impact of the personnel costs, the number of people that get out of the Air Force because the drone community has been so brutally used, the number of people that got out of the Air Force because they weren't going to go into that community, all that had a cost. The cost for the U.S. Air Force to get back into UAVs was, I think, excessive. And I'm actually going to bring this back later as an industrial base issue. So let's see if I can take one of the most boring subjects I will ever have talked about, the American military industrial base, and make it funny and cool.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but if you'd like to support the channel, please do visit 10percenttrue.com and take a look at my store. You can buy polo shirts, t-shirts, stickers, patches, and even my books. And speaking of which, if you're listening to the podcast, this won't make sense, but if you're watching it, then great. The one that's being played in the background at the moment is my new book, F-15E Strike Eagle, Be Afraid of the Dark, Part 1. It's a glorious coffee table book, been professionally laid out and put together, tells the story of the Strike Eagle from 1984 to 2002. I'm taking pre-orders for it now. If you're interested in it, if you're thinking that might make a nice present for somebody, please do go ahead, visit 10percenttrue.com. Place an order. Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about, though, just again, stratification and definitions before we sort of move on and hopefully get to that challenge. So people who have been, let's say, not following drone warfare for the last 30 years, 20, 25 years, whatever it is, will probably be thinking drones like you're seeing now on the battlefield in in Ukraine. Sorry. Little first-person video type things, dropping thermite and dropping little grenades on soldiers and ramming themselves into tanks and trying to blow them up and all that kind of stuff. And you've just talked about cost. You've talked about the cost not in terms of the material, but in terms of the manpower, woman power, whatever the correct terminology is these days, in terms of the resource, in terms of all the infrastructure that has to go around it, and then in terms of being able to take that as capability and make it useful. Again, when you're thinking about drones, and you're talking about drones, and you're going to talk about the military industrial complex, are you thinking, okay, there's a stratification, all drones are equal, or are you thinking, well, we don't really think too much about things like predators these days, because the drones we're really worried about are the little ones where you can have tens of thousands of them and anyone can buy them?
So I definitely stratify. So there are military drones, okay, and we'll use the U.S. as an example, built to a military requirements process that fit into big Air Force or big Army or big Navy, cost amazing amounts of money, okay, and support a useful but ridiculously overpriced industry. Then there are your hobby class drones, which brought remote. Remember, they're kind of an outgrowth of the remote controlled aircraft hobbyists, and they've been around for many decades. So it's kind of an improvement and an expansion of remote controlled flight because it became cooler with technology. And then you have, I think, kind of a mid-range, which is your heavier commercial drones, which are not something you or I would go out and buy, but which serve a bunch of viable commercial photography. Like go to a real estate site, okay, and start looking at houses. Maybe not in the UK, but someplace cool, like the Caribbean, okay. And just say you're looking for a house. They're going to have a video, and who will have taken that video? Some dude that charged the real estate agent to take the video with a 35 millimeter camera strapped onto the bottom of a drone. Wedding photos are taken that way. Governments use them. A lot of interesting data comes out of Russian academics doing drones in the Arctic. Because, for research and development, for obvious reasons. When you can't start your drone's motor, or your airplane's motor, then having an electric motor, or something small that you can keep in your car till you're ready to launch. All these things are kind of different categories for different purposes. So if you're going to force me to divide into three categories, it's going to be your high-end, high-grade, larger drones. And then it's kind of your mid-grade, 200 pounds or less commercial drones. And then your hobby class drones like the Mavics, or something like that. And, there's a lot of home builds out there now. I mean, I've got two under construction right here, not 6 feet away from me.
Is there, just to throw the cat amongst the pigeons, is there a fourth class then? I remember reading, 20 years ago by, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was the BBC's defense correspondent at the time. He wrote a book about the weapon systems of the future. I mean, and he talked about, little sort of 30 millimeter bullets that had little puffer jets in them, and they'd be able to guide themselves to hit the target and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that he talked about was little micro drones that were almost that would be released. And the use case he gave, I'm sure there were many, but the use case he gave was that they would be released on the battlefield, and they would effectively coagulate. So they would come together and climb up the exhaust or into the oil port or something of a tank on the battlefield, and they would clog the engine, because that's how they would work. Now, I don't know if those things ever materialized, but I did see a video 3 or 4 years ago of a Navy Hornet dropping effectively a CBU canister that was stuffed full of very small drones. I'm not entirely sure what the use case is for that, but is that a fourth category? I
don't think so. It's mostly because it's not yet. So the smallest drones I'm aware of that have actual, no kidding, combat use are like the Black Hornet class drones, which are military, tiny reconnaissance drones for the soldier level. But the fact is, the Ukrainians use micro whoop drones to do that right now. I mean, they can go on Alibaba and order small, This is actually bigger. Okay. See if we can get this on. Yeah. This is actually bigger than a micro whoop, right? This is some 250 grams, and it's not that big. We're talking about something that you can assemble or you can buy off the shelf it is a quarter of this size or less. That instead of having, this, when I put the props on, it's like 3-inch diameter fan. Well, with the ducks, it's like 2.5-inch diameter. You're talking about 1-inch diameter blades, tiny motors spinning stuff up. So those are, I think, an aspect of both the military drone, if you want to pay $30,000 for your cool one, or the hobbyist drone, where you're taking a hobbyist item and using it. The reality is you can divide drones any which way.
Mm.
But the question I want people to ask when it comes to weaponized drones as weapons, is it a drone or is it a munition? Is a Tomahawk cruise missile a drone or a munition?
Yeah.
My answer is it's a munition. But if you were to write a bunch of definitions down, it doesn't have a person in it. It flies autonomously. It goes from point A to point B. That is a drone.
Because it's the big distinction then that a munition, once it's been released, you're expecting it to go boom. A drone doesn't have to go boom, does it? I mean, I guess if you take it to the limits of its range and it's running out of battery, you're gonna lose it. But you could take it halfway and bring it back. You can't do that with a Tomahawk or JASM.
Right. So that's the definitional separation that I prefer, and that is, if you bring it back, it's a drone, which sets with the fire bees and sets with other stuff. And if it's one way, it's not. So one of the things I hate this. People describe Shahed 136s and 131s as kamikaze drones. Are you freaking kidding me? They're cruise missiles. They're low-cost cruise missiles. What the hell is a kamikaze drone? It's a low-cost cruise missile. So the Shahed, for the audience who might not be really into this, the Shahed is an Iranian-built bat wing, kind of flying wing type drone that carries a 40-kilo warhead and goes about 1,000 kilometers, reliant on GPS that they've been bombarding. The Iranians provided to Russians, and the Russians build their own. They call it the Geran 2. And I may be mispronouncing that, but it's definitely GERAN-2. And I'm pronouncing 2 correctly. Those are low-cost cruise missiles. The Iranians and the Russians have achieved what the Americans have failed to do consistently for probably 30 or 40 years, is build a low-cost cruise missile. Mm-hmm. So my personal definition is, if it's one way, it's not a one-way attack drone. It's a munition. And if it's two ways, it's a drone. That's just the Starbaby definition. Anybody can use it. It's not copyrighted. I don't get paid.
You never get paid. It's a surprise you can afford to keep a roof over your head.
Sometimes there are days I feel like that. I envision retirement when I can, go live under a bridge overpass someplace.
Okay, so we've got some definitions. We've got some idea of sort of sizes and values and purpose and that kind of thing. So where does your analysis go next then? Do you go straight? I mean, do you sort of skip over that period of the Predator suddenly becoming, well, not suddenly, they've eventually becoming armed? The CIA took the Predator and armed it first, I think. I think it was the agency that did that first, and the Air Force still had unarmed, and then you ended up with MQ-1B, the properly fully armed derivative of the Predator, different engine, I think. Obviously some other differences. And does your mind then go more towards sort of, I don't know, sort of the mid sort of level, the mid-price type drone, and start looking at that? Or, does all of it have a role to play in where we are today?
Predators are like jellyfish. They scare the hell out of me for no good reason. So I would just as soon not think about jellyfish, and I would just as soon not think about predators. And at this stage of the game, they're kind of uninteresting. My stance for a long time has been counter to the prevailing theory. So in many cases, and you can see people write about this today, because a drone is unmanned does not mean it is invisible. So I see it all the time. Well, we're going to use predators to shoot SA-10s. Are you kidding me? What, are they invisible? I mean, how are they going to find them? They're like the Russians are going to let them saunter up, except that the Russians have let drones saunter up to air defense systems and plink them. So for decades, for easily 20 years, you're not going to get a unmanned remote control drone in on a air defense system, and the Ukrainians do it almost every day. Okay. So it's not that I'm uninterested in the Predator and Reaper so much as it is that I'm completely uninterested in the Predator and the Reaper. That is old, traditional. That's like the traditional drone, and I don't care about it anymore. Not that they're not useful. I just don't care.
Okay, let me just ask you really quickly then about this, just because it just came to mind while you were talking about it. That I'm pretty sure that in 1992 or thereabouts, might have been 3 or 4. Well, it must have been later because I'm not entirely sure when Predator came about, but let's say it was in the 1990s. One of them took a pot shot at a MiG-25, lost because the MiG-25 shot it down. Southern Watch, it must have been Iraqi. It must have been Operation Southern Watch, so Southern Iraq. That mission set, the air-to-air mission set, as far as I can tell, doesn't, at the moment at least, doesn't really exist as a thing. I mean, that's not to say there aren't black programs. There's Loyal Wingman as a program, which maybe you'll get into. Super, super expensive. You're talking about the military industrial complex, and that maybe is part of that conversation. I don't know. You know, there's some pretty good indications that the US Air Force has really embraced drone wingmen for fighter aviation, let's say.
Yeah, because it's high tech.
So
I have to have it.
They've acquired it, but that's not something that's mainstream. So I'm guessing that probably most of the stuff you're going to talk about, or you are talking about, is air to ground. Sort of something from the sky hitting something on the ground. Tell me about the air to air stuff. You're smirking. So tell me about air to air, that and whether or not that is something that has been developed in your view. And if you can't talk about it, obviously you won't. But what about it?
Decoys. Okay, so we can talk Southern Watch, although actually in that particular event, I can't.
Okay.
So have you heard of Scathe Mean?
No.
Scathe Mean has long since been declassified, so I can talk about it. This was the bunch of Firebead drones, and they were no-kidding target drones that served as decoys in the opening hours of Desert Storm. Brought out into the desert, fired to stimulate the Iraqi air defense network so that weasels would have SAMs on the air when they showed up and not have to troll for them themselves.
Is that what Bat Press ran? So I don't know if you've got that far. I know you're going through my back catalog.
I haven't. Okay, but I think it is from the description.
Okay. So he never mentioned the program name, but Scathe Mean.
Scathe Mean, and that's how you can look it up online.
Okay, all right.
And so decoys are a thing, right? So the ITALD, the Improved Tactical Air Launch Decoy, the Tactical Air Launch Decoy, this goes back to the 50s, right? Because you had the B-52 had missiles. A Quail, I believe, was a decoy. So the use against aerial target thing by unmanned objects is even older than the Firebeat program. And both the Ukrainians and the Russians do it all the time. So I wrote an article about the F-40 Warhawk. I think it's called Not Your Grandfather's Combat Aircraft. This is almost 10 years ago. The F-40 Warhawk doesn't exist.
Oh, okay.
So I was writing...
What is that? Yeah.
Right. No, it doesn't exist. I made it up.
Yeah.
And because the point I was illustrating was actually the possibility of what you could do with a smart or semi-smart wingman as a lightweight fighter. So it might have been called the next lightweight fighter. And in any case, it can be found. And so with that conceptually, I explore, hey, what if you use it as a missile caddy to carry extra? It becomes harder than you think, because when fighter operations are all air refueled, you've now added in another very expensive requirement to anything you want to accompany your fighter. For air refueling. That also dictates your size. What kind of ordnance load do you have to carry? That inflicts your size. It also brings cost up. So the question becomes, what are you actually saving money on? So there is every reason to believe that drones have a future in counter air, because they do it every day, and in air to air, because the potential has always been there. How well realized that will be and what it takes is another question entirely.
Okay.
But then, if they're one-way air-to-air things, then they're just a missile.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another question while I'm thinking about it. You don't have to answer it right away. But just again, to throw the cat amongst the pigeons, optionally manned. So, are you thinking, again, as part of your analysis and when you're looking at this stuff, are you thinking about optionally manned platforms? And because those, I guess, would almost certainly, sort of be coming back. They're going to be super expensive, so they're not going to be wasting them. But is optionally manned is also in your sort of vision for your analysis?
The Air Force fielded its first optionally manned aircraft in the Vietnam War. And it was a comm relay aircraft, as I recall. I can't remember the name of it, but it's in one of my War on the Rocks articles. And they never used it as a remote control aircraft. They always put a person in it. So I ask you the question of what is the purpose of an optionally manned aircraft? What does it get you? What possible value is there to optional manning? Because, go ahead. Answer it.
Yeah. I mean, I know you're talking rhetorically. But sort of Gary Powers is the name that comes to mind. If you want to, let's say, for whatever reason, you decide you're going to fly your intelligence gathering airframe directly over China or directly over Russia. You want it to be deniable. You take up the paint on it so that it doesn't have any national markings on it. Whatever. The one big telltale that you've got is if it gets shot down, you've got a pilot or a pilot and a Rio or whatever. So presumably that's the use case. Very long flights where they would exceed the tolerances of a human being. Or a single human being. Let's say. I mean, I know.
How long is that flight?
Well, B-52s do like 36 hours, don't they? B-2s, I think, do similar sort of thing.
Round the world flights.
That's two people, right? So maybe you want to do 2 days, 3 days. I don't know. But Gary Powers is for me the obvious reason you'd want to be able to fly a platform over somewhere and not have a person in it.
So I would say that there's a couple things about that. One is the technology in 1960 to fly an unmanned aircraft and actually get what you were aiming for was not quite where it is today. Second is the reason Gary Powers got bagged is because that the aircraft had already had a failure that dropped him to lower altitude. And that had that been an autonomous aircraft or an unmanned aircraft, you would have lost it. So I'm not saying there isn't value to like unmanned recon, but why would you design a system to have a person in it and then decide there are not times to put a person in it? The obvious excuse is that, it's too high risk a mission. But aircraft are so expensive, you cannot accept the idea that you use your aircraft as attrition assets. Because then you're taking an expensive aircraft that you went through all this development time, it costs a bunch of money, you say, it's an attrition asset now. It's like, that's like saying, hey, we're just going to use 737s because they've got great freaking autopilots. Although there are some formerly living pilots who might disagree with how good their autopilots are. Why would you do that? It sounds cool. Hold on. I've got to have it. Sounds good. Technologically advanced. Of what military utility is it? And I would suggest that the answer is none whatsoever. Because, and this is, so General Slife is the Vice Chief of Staff for the Air Force. Okay. Great guy. Okay. Tolerates me, which makes him definitely a great guy. And one of the things, he doesn't come from a fighter background. He's a special ops guy. So he asks a lot of uncomfortable questions of fighter guys. One of which is, what do we need fighters for? It's like, of course we need fighters. Why? Because they're maneuverable. Okay. What do you need? What kind of effect do you need to generate on the battlefield that you need a fighter? Because that comes with a whole bunch of other things. Yeah, it's maneuverable, but it's relatively short range. Gotta have it. Gotta have fighters because I'm a fighter guy. Damn it, General Slife is right. Why do we need to have fighters? And the answer I have to that question is because the purpose of the fighter aircraft is to put a fighter aviator in a time and in a place for that aviator to gain an effect or to rage destruction and hellfire upon the enemy, I think is the way I put it. And so the follow-on question is, why does it have to be a fighter aviator? Bomber aviators do that too. Okay, that's right. So I think that, and my first War in the Rocks article was why the next fighter aircraft will be manned and the one after that. That's how I opened my kind of writing career, where I was just publishing stuff left and right, as opposed to just in Air Force professional publications. And so I think that the important part is that warfare is a human endeavor, and it's done better when you have humans in it. And it's an article you've no doubt, I'm sure you've read it because I've put it on links so many times on Discord. Yes, I was going to say, if you said you haven't read it, I would chastise you roundly. So
many times.
But that's kind of where it comes back to optional manning, manned, unmanned. There's places on those. But warfare is a human endeavor. And you see that once you start taking the human out of the process, you end up with a whole bunch of unintended effects. And so General Slife is right. Why do we need fighters? And why do we need fighter aviators? We need airmen in combat because wars are not fought, or more importantly, wars are not won by remote control. And you're going to turn this into a 4-part episode, by the way. Next question.
Well, I was going to say we've kind of, in a way, we've just talked about changing mission sets, haven't we? Because you have, because you've gone from describing the genesis of the drones as we know them today being the the Firebees that were being launched from wherever. I think they were launched from B-52s, weren't they? And then they went and did their recon, and then didn't they just land in the sea somewhere and someone picked up the film canister? I don't know the full story, but
they were mostly snagged midair.
They were snagged. Yeah, they were snagged. Yeah, okay, yeah.
And some of them were even snagged midair by helicopters.
So you've described that, and now we're talking about warfare being won by people. So you've kind of in that respect demonstrated a real transition from one mission set for drones to a mission set now where the kinetic capability of the drone is what's making a difference to the warfare, to the war, rather than just its ability to inform battlefield commanders by giving them pictures or intelligence or whatever. So expound on that then. Where do drones sit then in the order of battle of a military force like the US Air Force, or the order of a battle of the force of something like ISIS?
Yeah, so I'm going to ignore the US Air Force where commercial drones sit, because the US Air Force is still sitting on its thumbs, wondering how they're going to use that. So people talk about the democratization of air power, people including me, but I didn't coin the term. And it's one of those things. It's the democratization of information, or the democratization of cyber, or the democratization, say that 3 times fast, and I just couldn't, of whatever it happens to be. So what we've got now with drones, and it's really an 11-year-old process, 10 and a half years, is that drones have accomplished what we call drones, have accomplished what the big departments of defense could never do. And that was match together precision, mass, and low cost. And so now the Ukrainians are, yes, they're using low cost cruise missiles to strike targets deep inside Russia, and good on them for it. But Ukrainian estimates for the amount of drones they expended in 2024 was 2 million drones, wow, which means that their ammunition The vast majority of drones are now essentially infantry support weapons because they have taken precision, and because of the low cost, they provided it in numbers. So where you formerly, when you had an anti-tank grenade that you launched out of your RPG-7 tube or your grenade launcher, okay, now that's the precision weapon that costs a couple of $100. And if you don't use it, you can bring it back. Although I think bringing back armed weapons is chancy. We know that this happens. So that is one of the big changes. So one is now anybody can combine a drone and a warhead to have a precision weapon, and it's cheap enough that you can do it in large numbers. The second is the speed of innovation is happening at almost the speed of ideas plus a soldering iron. And so, ministries of defense, departments of defense flat out cannot keep up with what's going on. They can't steer it. They can't fund it because you talk about and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. Talk about the Ukrainians using drones. Every Ukrainian drone user has their own needs and requirements. And when they set their own requirements, they fill their requirements. So, guys who are part of an infantry company, okay, they may do reconnaissance, they may do direct attack. Okay, those are kind of their requirements. Guys who are intelligence gatherers, different set of requirements, and they might have more money available. They might go heavier. Are you doing night attack? Are you doing harassment? Are you 2 kilometers across the front line? Are you 5? Are you 20? Are you 1,200? Everybody has a different set of requirements. So that, because you're basically dealing with, it's almost like small arms. So everybody bring the contents of your gun cabinet to the fight. So that's a different set of requirements. And I think the last is when we look at these things can be, I won't say they're easy to use, but they are based on particularly the first person view drones, the FPV drones. This is something people do for fun. Okay. If it weren't relatively quick to pick up, people would not pursue the hobby. And because you're dealing with hobbyist level equipment, that means that particularly the Chinese, they provide a massive industrial infrastructure behind the let's do hobby class drones. And, hobby class drone, decent lift capability, an extra battery, an RPG-7 warhead, and some coat hangers. And the next thing you know, you've got a tank killer. Yep. So those kind of combine, I think, to bring something to the battlefield that hasn't been on the battlefield for a long time. Since guys were comparing, well, my sharpened obsidian is better than your fire-hardened stick.
Tell me a little bit about your views on China then and supply chain and the industrial base that produces this. So 2 million declared by Ukraine as being used in 2024. I'm guessing, I don't know anything about it, but I'm guessing that a lot of those or most of those come from China. We already know about the importance of not having those sorts of dependencies in the West. I mean, Taiwan is an example of, they produce 80% of the world's chips for mobile phones and tablets and that kind of stuff. And I was talking to somebody about that the other day who's in that business. He said it's just, it's their ability to generate the quality that you need. And it's very precise and takes all these skills, and you have to have, all this knowledge and so on and so forth. And, because I was saying, can you not just shift it away? Just go and build it in Texas or, whatever. So, but from a drone point of view, then, if you're talking about your potential adversary having a monopoly on the market that provides them, is that a good idea? Are Ukraine getting production sorted out for themselves? What about supply chains then?
All of that is happening. So wave your hands here. Wave your hands like you're making a bookmark. Okay, great. Because we have to bookmark this, because this is where this is genuinely boring shit. Okay, so because the biggest hobbyist force for small drones is China, it means that China controls the biggest manufacturing And because they produce cheap products in large numbers. So
Yep.
everything, motors, your motor controller, we call them ESCs, electronic speed controllers. The uplink, downlink to bring the video, the goggles, that you wear, or the flight controller that you use, the antennas that you put on your thing, the carbon frames that you print. The majority of these are going to be in China. And because the market is so big, they can effectively service it. Now, in the US, the hobbyist market was suppressed. Why was it suppressed? Because the Federal Aviation Administration did not want people to get into drones. Okay, and so there was a decade-long fight over what they were allowed. And eventually the FAA actually adopted a lot of rules that look suspiciously like their European Union rules. And so in this rule-based environment, the US government made it as hard as possible. The other thing is that the US government itself distorted the market, because since the Predator in 1995, DoD has paid too much for every single drone component. And it's doing it today. Okay, so the flight, I'm going to bring this back again. And this is, I do not get paid for this. And it's amazing I even remember who manufactured this stuff. The brains of this, the autopilot, is made by a mom and pop shop that goes by the name of Brain FPV. It is compliant with, it's manufactured in the US by a US company. And so the US government could buy it. And it's $100. If I go and try and find an autopilot with similar capabilities, and I go to the approved US government list because it's approved, who gets approved on the list? Well, the people who already have military contracts, who are not competitive in the civilian environment. So why would I pay $400 for an autopilot when I can buy it off the web at $100 and it's still made in the US? So Congress, and as much as I like to diss our congressional masters, this was actually pretty smart. So in 2018, they started restricting the U.S. government use of foreign drone components, but make no mistake about it, it's Chinese drone components. So it's a bit of protection, but the reality is it's national security because of the fact that the Chinese, like the Americans before them, embedded intelligence gathering capabilities into their products. And then in 2020, what we call the 2020 NDAA, which is National Defense Authorization Act, which is what funds the Department of Defense. And it gets a bunch of little laws added in. And it said, look, you can't use Chinese stuff. And that was later amended to mean you can't use it from China, North Korea, or Iran. Like I'm buying commercial drone parts from Iran, right? Okay, but you can't buy commercial drone parts from that. So they're shifting the point where the U.S. can't use Chinese drone parts, and they're the only people that can't. So the Ukrainians build their own. They grab parts. They buy Chinese off the shelf. Okay, and that's why they can field 2 million drones. A lot of those are commercially provided. The Americans, I have to submit, in theory, right? If I were a U.S. government agency, I would have to submit a waiver that says I need an exception to policy. And it's, oh, well, an exception to policy to use Chinese drone parts. That's smart. No, I have to submit a waiver to use any commercial drone part. So any commercial drone part, whether it's made or not in the US or the EU, if it's what we call NDAA compliant, which is compliant with the law. In order to be NDAA compliant, I need to ask for an exception to policy for every single component in every single drone I want to build, because the policy is you need an exception to policy. That's the Department of Defense making things more complicated. That is not what Congress intended, and it's not what they wrote in the law, but that's the way it is. So from a U.S. innovation perspective, hey, can I use Chinese motors? Yes, they're not critical components. Okay. Can I use a Chinese GPS? No. Why not? Because it's a radio. But it doesn't transmit. Doesn't matter. It's a radio. It's on the list, man. It's a radio. Can't use it.
Wow.
Video recording, hard drives, anything. So it makes it more difficult and more expensive, and it has distorted the market. And that's the boring industrial base part, is China has the industrial base for cheap drones in mass quantities. Ukraine is building it. The Department of Defense is suppressing the American industrial base and forcing it to be more expensive than it otherwise would be and more difficult to negotiate. So really, we've shot ourselves in the foot since 2018.
I don't know if this is a good jumping off point then to talk about a country that has been successful in developing its drone capabilities and industries. And we talked about it on the phone. I mean, to contrast with what the US has done, Turkey has done the opposite.
Yeah. So Turkey. The best research projects, the ones I enjoy the most, are the ones where I go into it looking at something and I find things that I didn't know were there in a direction I didn't know I was going to travel. So it's kind of weird, but I like finding out that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Okay, because then I have to find out what was right. So I was just asked a question. It's like in 2020, Azerbaijan and Armenia fought a short war over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. We're not going to get into this because the audience, they can look it up. But it was an effective use of drones, okay, including the first times I'd actually seen drones killing active air defense systems. And so the question came up, well, Starbaby, how did they do it? So fortunately, the Azeris published a bucket load of propaganda video with their drone kills. And so I started looking at it, and their primary weapon was a TB2, the Bayraktar. People make songs about it. You can look it up. They're actually not bad songs, by the way. It was a star of the early days of after the most recent invasion. Remember, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, not 2022. 2022 was the third invasion in this particular group. But the TB2 was raging on Russian systems. And then they disappeared from the battlefield. Why did they disappear from the battlefield? Because they were all shot down. Or the electronic warfare environment became unusable. One of the reasons they were able to do so much damage to Russian air defense and catch it on video was because the push from the north out of Belarus towards Kyiv, they ran out of gas. No gas, which you run to keep your vehicle warm because it's February. That means no radios, no radar, and you can't even ignite your missiles. So yes, the TB2s are killing left and right. But before any of that happened, the TB2s were being used in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I was trying to figure out how they were getting in on targets. And the short answer is they were killing SA-8s, and they were flying above the radar beams of the SA-8's acquisition. Once you get to a certain altitude, the SA-8 does not camp their acquisition radar up high enough, okay? And they don't see you. So you come in above 20,000 feet, SA-8 wouldn't see you. Now, in Azerbaijan, they have SA-8s. They knew it. And it was amazing because these are Turkish aircraft, and I'm going, wow, this is some pretty advanced techniques. I wonder where the Azeris learned these. And so naturally, I take their propaganda video, and really, I mean, their techniques are excellent. This is graduate level laser placement. And then I go back to Turkish video from Syria, okay, where they're supporting Kurdish freedom fighters. And it's like, well, shoot, it's a couple of years back. They weren't that good. Oh, and let's look again. Where else can I find TB2s? Libya. Let's go back a couple more years and see Turkish TB2s over Libya. Well, they've released a bunch of We're Studs video. Ooh, these guys suck. Yeah, they are not good. What I was able to trace through marketing and propaganda video was the evolution of the Turkish operators behind the TB2. So they started learning in Libya. They got better in Turkey and Syria. And by the time they show up in Azerbaijan, and I'm convinced that it was the Turks flying Azeri aircraft, although I have no other confirmation of that, that's graduate level stuff. I mean, they're hitting targets under trees. They've got the tactical patience to see a missile launcher launch and then go someplace else. Whereas when I saw like the Israelis sold them loitering munitions, which were video and command guided in, I was seeing a much lower level of tactical ability with those because they were brand new and those were new operators. You know, for example, when you target a tank, They kept landing on the top of the turret. It's like, why would you do that? You put your small munition, it's a small munition.
Yeah.
You put it on the engine deck and go for the mobility kill. You don't try and aim for the open commander's hatch. But if you're a new guy, that's what you do. You try to aim for the open hatch and you don't hit it. And so I saw Armenian tanks that shrugged off these hits because they hit the turret. So the Turks really became a first-tier UAV supplier. I mean, the operators there, the U.S. and Israel, were obviously tier one, and the Turks slipped in without anybody noticing, and by 2020, they had their act together. So that's where, unexpectedly, I realized that there had been a lot of development going on. What I had missed was Ukraine, because I hadn't looked at it, and there had been nothing to draw me into it. So in 2014, of course, the Russians seized Crimea and then fomented a revolt in the Donbass. And when that didn't work, intervened directly in late 2014. So those I count as the first and second invasions of Ukraine. And in late 2014, Aero Rozvidka was formed. And for anybody that speaks Ukrainian on this, I'm going to mispronounce everything. Apologies in advance. It's hard. I tried to go to like Wikipedia and get a pronunciation guide for some of these names, and no good. So there was an investment banker, Volodymyr, and let's see, Kolechkov Sukak. Call sign is reported different ways, but Chubak or Chewy or Chewbacca. Okay, big old bearded investment banker who basically co-founded Aero Rozvidka, and these guys started a militia that essentially was going to use drones to drop bombs on Russians. And he was killed within a year, setting something up in a border area, and he tripped a landmine. But by that time, the ball was rolling, and what the Ukrainians started doing was custom making small munitions that you would drop off a hovering aircraft. You just put your aircraft over, you look straight down, you hit the release button. And the first one I became aware of was the RKG 1600. That's based on the RKG 3. Now, the RKG 3 is a potato masher style grenade that dates from the 50s. And any Army veteran who was in Iraq knows what an RKG 3 is, because the Iraqis had a lot of them. They used to make them. Egyptians made them, Bulgarians made them, Chinese made them, Vietnamese made them. A lot of RKG-3s out there, and it's a stick grenade. Much to my surprise, in the handle is not only a parachute, okay, because you're going to throw this, and you want it to land warhead forward so that it's a shaped charge, and it blows a copper jet through the armor. So it's got a parachute in the handle, but it also has 7 safety devices built into the grenade. Who knew? I mean, like a Russian grenade with safety devices. I'd never heard of such a thing. Now, you disable about 4 of them when you unscrew the handle. And so what the Ukrainians were doing is they would unscrew the handle, they would disable 4 of the safety devices, and they'd screw on 3D printed tail fins. And now you've got something that looks like a soda can with a 3D printed tail fin, and they're going to drop them on tanks. And they will burn through the top armor of a T-72 no matter where they hit it.
Wow.
And so this started happening in late 2014. I had no idea. It was not in my my instrument scan, right? I'm looking at the instruments. I'm just not looking outside enough. And so the Ukrainians have really started a revolution in small air power applications, and most people didn't notice.
The Russians must have noticed, though.
They did, but and they learned, and the Russians have introduced their own capabilities, but they're not up. They're not as up to speed, because they don't have the crowdsourcing assistance. They have to do a lot of other things. The Russians do some fairly tech savvy stuff, but they do not have a lot of high-tech industry that isn't dependent on Western stuff. And yes, the Chinese sell to both sides, but it appears from what I've seen that they charge the Russians more than they charge the Ukrainians. So it becomes a resource battle. And in this case, this is one of those rare cases where the Ukrainians are better resourced across the board. Plus, remember, Ukraine started the war and has for decades had a very good aviation and electronics industry. Right. So there's a lot of things, we call them Soviet systems, built in Ukraine, by Ukrainians to Ukrainian design.
Yeah.
So so that's kind of where they went small. And so plenty of people had talked about, small drones, and I had actually discounted ISIS. You mentioned ISIS, and they were using small drones. The Ukrainians were much more sophisticated because they were targeting them and dropping them and doing it by remote control. And so I had discounted the small drone because I was questionable about what a small drone could accomplish in an irregular type war. But when you kind of got into a conventional war where you've got tanks and fighting positions or so on, the Ukrainians said, hey, yeah, we can use that. And so what you have now is a precision supplement that can be brought down to the squad level, where you can put a more, you might have your 60 millimeter mortar, okay, fire a couple of rounds in the general direction of the enemy. Here you have that same warhead size, more or less, with a tank killing capability that you can put within 30 centimeters of where you aimed it.
Yep.
How about that?
So this is very interesting then. So if we just deal with the sort of medium-sized Turkish systems first, you described how they were shot down. Eventually, they were shot down quite quickly, and we didn't see them reappear again. That makes sense. You've talked about the smaller conflict where presumably it was Turkish operators who were using them very effectively. I don't want to say it was a permissive environment, but if they figured out there was a donut of sort of radar coverage around an SA-8, and you get into the hole, your quid's in, you can deal with the system, But presumably, if you have a more integrated or perhaps a better equipped or trained air defense system, you can deal with those bigger drones that aren't stealthy, that don't have low observability features built into them. You can deal with them fairly easily. The one thing that I find curious then is the smaller drones. So you're saying you saw through your research that initial Russian operation in Ukraine spawned then the birth of those smaller drones dropping the grenades in 2014. And I'm not an expert on this, and I do watch the videos, and so therefore maybe I'm just guilty of falling for the Ukrainian propaganda. But I look at those, and I think those are totally asymmetric systems. They have a material impact on the battlefield, on the ability for the infantryman to go and do his job. But Russia seems to have been slow to have figured out how to counter them. So 2014 is when those things started to appear. But in 2022, when the third invasion took place, they weren't driving their tanks around with cages. You now see the cages, which I think are supposed to. What are they supposed to do? Cause it to explode before it hits the turret? I don't know. You tell us.
Cope. It's so you can cope with the anxiety better.
Okay, I said.
Yeah, they're called cope cages. I didn't make that up either.
So they're like a placebo. All right, they just make you feel better because you think you're going to be better off if you've got one than not.
Yes, that's how cope cages developed, which led to turtle. By the way, turtle tanks are different.
But why has Russia been slow to deal with it? And again, not my area of expertise, but I have noticed in the last few months news articles about the US Army, for example, really getting into the technology to give the soldier on the battlefield the ability to jam drones and all that kind of stuff. Why is it so reactive? Why have military forces generally, the Russians in particular, been so slow to respond?
I'm going to say it's requirements writing is one of the first stops. So there's a couple steps here. One, I mentioned earlier, you're working at very rapid innovation speeds. Okay. And so you have to have a response circle, an OODA loop, as it were. As much as I hate that model because I don't think it's scalable, this is an application where it's usable, right? So whereby you react, you go through the next iteration. This happens in warfare all the time, right? But Western militaries and the Russians are not structured to do that. And so the Russians were slow because they're not fast. So it was how do you respond? How do you determine? I mean, the Russians had EW stuff. They had it on the battlefield. They had a wide variety of like backpackable stuff that was designed to defeat IEDs. Why wasn't that working? Well, you got to figure out why it's not working before you can figure out a fix. So you need to go back and forth. You need to spin up industry. And of course, the Russians early on in the war, when they tried to increase the conscription, they lost 1 million people who just left. And so it becomes a decision loop structure. How have you structured your defense enterprise in order to react to change? The U.S. is no better, okay? And arguably worse because we have industrial base limits. But who's writing the requirements? Are you kidding me? There's this giant. And if I'd thought about this ahead of time, I'd have brought the snapshot of the JSIDS process, which is the most obscenely complicated slide ever built. It's a wall hanging, and it has the advantage of being completely indecipherable, so I don't ever have to learn how to explain it. But it's all these steps and connections and so on. Who's writing the requirements? Who's validating the requirements? Are you kidding me? Okay, the Ukrainians have come out with 4 different drone models in the last 3 weeks, and you're asking me who's writing the requirements? So that's a problem for the Western militaries across the board, is who's writing the requirements? Who's authorized to innovate? Who has the resources to innovate? If 3rd Infantry Division wants to, have an FPV drone, well, who do they ask? Where do they get the resources? How do they pay for it? 3rd Infantry Division doesn't have procurement money, doesn't have research and development money. How do you get all that going? So the Russians were definitely late to react, but I think there's also an aspect of it wasn't clear early on how massively effective this stuff was going to be, because it's easy to focus on big systems. All that Ukraine needs is F-16s. All they need is Patriots. All they need is M1 tanks. All they need is Leopard 1s. It's always the next big shiny penny. This week we need better air-to-air missiles. While those were all true, the infantryman isn't going to benefit from any of those systems. Your average guy has to be able to look at a company strength assault coming towards Vuhledar, which is now fallen, and say, holy cow, I don't have any javelins. I need to stop this tank in its tracks. And I got an FPV drone and a warhead from an RPG-7. So combat needs drew innovation at a speed that none of the defense industries could actually capture. And it wasn't until a couple of years after Aerorozvika formed that it was absorbed into the government. That was a civilian militia for years.
Okay. So talking a bit more about Ukrainian innovation in particular, then I suppose our conversation so far has been focused on the sort of air to ground perspective, but you also have the sea as a domain, and you have undersea as a domain. The Ukrainians at the moment are doing some interesting things with their, I can't remember what they call them, but they've got sea UAVs, don't they? They've got sea boats.
The Magura.
Okay,
the latest model is the Magura 5. So the original boats appear to have been fiberglass hulls added to jet skis with a satellite. It was a satellite terminal. So again, open source intelligence, and anybody that actually, you could take a free class on open source. It's an organization called Bellingcat. Bellingcat are the guys that used open source data to figure out who really shot down the Malaysian air flight over Ukraine. They are amazing, but they now have courses that teach you how to do open source intelligence. There were also a bunch of guys, for example, that when a span of the bridge connecting Crimea with Russia, the Kerch Bridge, when that was dropped, there was a lot of argument. We had guys saying, "Oh, it had to be ATACMS." It wasn't ATACMS. ATACMS isn't going to ever drop a bridge. It's just not big enough bang. This was obviously the first time around. It was a truck bomb. We had hobbyists looking at Russian social media photos and looking at twisted metal from the rack and pinion steering on the front of the truck and saying, "Oh, that's this model truck." It was crowdsourcing the intelligence expertise. It was freaking amazing. Okay. And then guys go back and say, well, actually, this truck was photographed at this time and had this license plate. This is the guy that owned it. This is the dude who's probably in it. That was done through open source social media.
Wow.
And so, you see that across the board now is where you can crowdsource your analysis. And so looking at the Magura 5, it was like, hey, it's got the back end of a Canadian Ski-Doo jet ski. Like, woohoo. Now, I don't know what they're built of now, and if I did the 5th version, I wouldn't tell anybody. But those drones have effectively suppressed, damaged, or sunk a good part of the Russian Black Sea fleet. And I saw film last week of apparently one of those drones shooting down a helicopter. So I had seen missiles put on rails on the Magura 5. It looked like an Archer, modified AA-11. And I said, there's no way that's ever going to work. Ukrainians appear to have pulled it off. Not once, but twice, with one apparent shoot down and one apparent damaging. So, yes, they are obviously leading the way with sea drones as well. And there's been some publicity on both sides about ground drones as well. The Russians played ground drones a lot in like Zapad 2021. I think it was Zapad 2021. That's a big exercise that they do every 4 years. And they had a program. Oh, geez, what was it called? Combat Effective or something like that, which was Russian propaganda designed for an English-speaking audience, showing how great Russian weapons were. And they showed their robots, and they were pretty cool, but they didn't really show up on the battlefield in 2022. But ground UAVs are definitely being used, and I've seen video again provided by Ukraine that showed a ground UAV dislodging a fighting position. I've seen them towing mines, a bunch of mines on a string. You want to lay a minefield? Just put a bunch of mines on a string and drive your ground vehicle out there. It's like, okay, so that was cool. Don't try this at home. But I also saw them being used for mine clearance. So, we joke, but the one of the mine clearance methods is to rocket launch what is basically a long fire hose full of explosive and detonate it to create enough overpressure to clear the mines. Well, if you don't have a rocket, how do you get your fire hose out there? Well, you drag it behind a UGV. And it can actually be explosives packed into a fire hose. So, yes, the Russia-Ukrainian war is driving innovation on the small scale, company, platoon, and squad level in a way that the West has not kept up with. And the Russians are chasing the Ukrainians realistically, but the Russians are ahead of I think the West in that as well.
Before I ask you about sort of countermeasures, then I want to pick up on the example that you've just given, where you said you've got your infantry platoon or squad. There's some tanks coming their way. They don't have any javelins or whatever else it is that they're going to use, and then they've got an FPV drone instead. What's your assessment then of how much impact these have had? Because I guess that they're a very strong psychological warfare tool. You put videos out of I saw a video last week of apparently two North Koreans. One North Korean shoots the other while he's trying to shoot the drone down. That's going to be demoralizing for your adversary to watch that kind of thing. They obviously provide real-time BDA that you can put out there and use for propaganda purposes. So from my point of view as a civilian, from the outside looking in, they seem to be very impactful. I was thinking today, again, having said I never really do any prep, I was thinking I should think about some of these drone things. And I was thinking, well, you could weaponize those commercial drones at Lakenheath by switching the lights off and making a wall of them when they come to recover at nighttime. When the F-35s come back to recover at nighttime, you make a wall of them in the sky. They can't, well, I don't know, the F-35 might be able to see them, but take one of those down the intake, you're probably going to lose the aeroplane, right? So that's the kind of thing you could do. But are they really, at the moment at least, do they really make an impact? Are they turning the tide in anyone's favor or disfavor?
Okay, so they are making a tactile impact every day. Because it is allowing a force that is vastly outnumbered, where the Russians have massive artillery superiority. the Ukrainians have the ability down to the lowest level to put individual precision fires on a target. And so these aren't necessarily javelin equivalents, right? If you get a javelin in on a tank, the tank's done. Particularly a Russian tank, because it's going to explode and do the Olympic competition turret toss. But you can immobilize your tank. And so you end up with a multi-step process where you see a company coming towards your fighting position, you immobilize a couple tanks, and you've put mines out there, possibly with your UAVs. Okay. And now you immobilize a tank, and then later the tank's abandoned. What happens when you hop out of a tank? Okay, your tank's immobilized. You decide it's best to get out because stationary tanks are just targets. Do you close the hatch behind you? No, you don't. So now you've got where a Ukrainian FPV pilot has put on his goggles and flown his drone into a target and gone, yes! Now there's another guy that comes along at night who's carrying these little bomblets or hand grenade style stuff, and he's going to orient himself over those open hatches, and it's like a competition to put a grenade into that. What does that do? The tank's already been abandoned. It makes it impossible to recover and regenerate. So you've kind of got these layers of things where you're breaking up a tank, you are immobilizing vehicles, you are following up to prevent recovery. By the way, if a recovery vehicle came out, you'd try and immobilize it as well. You know, what you've done is you've given guys a capability to defend themselves in the case of the Ukrainians that the government cannot supply them and cannot supply them in numbers, and that they can really build themselves. So that's the big change, and it has been effective tactically. And has it been effective operationally? So that's a good question. So if you don't look at the Institute for the Study of War, okay, it's understandingwar.org. They do a daily assessment of operational level Russian activities. They don't really report on Ukrainian activities because we don't want the Russians to read this stuff. So they give a good picture. And one of the things they've been pointing out in the past week is the reason the Russians are not really being successful in Ukraine at taking territory, yes, they're advancing, but they're advancing slowly, is because they can't maneuver. Why can't they maneuver? Because the moment they come out of the open and maneuver, FPV drones flying at 100 miles an hour are coming in on their vehicles, coming in on individual guys if nothing else is available. They're doing hunter-killer operations. They may have anticipated you. And remember, the cargo drone can deliver a pizza or your Amazon package. It can also deliver a TM62 mine. Okay, that's just sitting on that roadway. And you don't have to deliver a mine in front of the Russians. You can deliver a mine behind the Russians to get that supply truck. Or, you force the Russians into a retreat. The next thing you know, they're in a minefield behind their own lines. So it's definitely having a tactical effect. And I would argue that the operational effect is that drones are one of the key aspects, along with artillery. But when you run low on artillery ammunition, then you're back down to drones that prevent the Russians from engaging in the war of maneuver that they would prefer to engage in. Okay, now, the strategic attack of drones, when you're hitting oil refineries, you're having a strategic effect. If you're setting a hangar on fire, next to an air, you don't even know what's in the hangar, maybe less of a strategic effect, but it's very much like the Doolittle raid on Japan, which was militarily ineffective and huge for propaganda purposes, and it did affect the entire Japanese mindset about attacks on the home island. And the other interesting piece is drones, you can hear them. Don't think that doesn't have an effect. Okay, it does have an effect. The Russians write all the time about the Baba Yaga drones. So if you're not familiar with Eastern fairy tales are not where Cinderella gets the charming prince and they all live happily ever after. That's not how Eastern European fairy tales work. But Baba Yaga is, on most accounts, an evil witch that travels in a hut that has giant chicken legs, and that's how she gets it around. So it's the original mobile home or recreational vehicle, right, is Baba Yaga's hut. That's what the Russians call the Ukrainian night drones. They can hear them coming. They see in thermal. They don't have lights, and they drop stuff on you.
Yeah.
So that definitely has a battlefield effect. And I was just reading a manual actually for, how do you deal with a drone attack? Because you can hear it coming, and it's like, don't run. It's like, if you run, you're dead. You are now the single moving pixel on that guy's $100 camera. Okay, that he's seeing through a crappy video in a foxhole, and you run and you're toast. Whereas if you just froze next to a tree, guy's probably going to fly right by you.
Right.
Of course, then somebody will hit you with a mortar, but
You mentioned 10, 15 minutes or so ago Russian EW gear. I remember from, I think, one of the analyses that you did when we were doing them a couple of years ago, February 2022 is when that invasion took place, and I think we did a few months afterwards. But I remember you talking about them having pretty good EW gear, but maybe not, maybe jamming themselves with it, maybe not using it as well as they should have or could have. Can you discuss a little what the countermeasures are for these drones then? I mean, I know you're not gonna spill any secret sauce, but just generally, is it a simple case of saying, well, if you've got, look, these are commercial off the shelf things, they operate presumably at a set range of frequencies. You must know what those frequencies are, or be able to figure them out. Okay, so you might get some electronic fratricide in terms of you jam your own gear while you've got your jammer on. You're not going to have any blanker systems, in your sort of your own drone operating sort of equipment. But is it a simple case of saying, okay, find out the frequencies and just jam them?
It's never simple, but let me attack that a different way. So, where were your commercial drone frequencies? They were assigned. And so, using the American assignments, you had a small band around 915 megahertz. You had a bigger band around 2400 megahertz. And you have another band up at 5800 megahertz. Those are the center frequencies. And as you go higher in frequency, these bands become wider. They were public use bands, or for the Internet of Things. For 900, you've got your long-range cordless telephones or your garage door openers. The Europeans have, I think, 868 megahertz, which is a different function that's not legal in the US. There's also like 433. And commercial drones users had been moving up in frequency because the bandwidths were wider and you could compare more channels. When you're down at low frequency, you have better range and you have better tree penetration. But if you've got 8 racers out there doing 915 megahertz, you can actually end up, I mean, this is pure EWO stuff, but you can end up dropping enough packets, little bursts of information, that your drone is not responsive. And if you're not responsive and you're drone racing, then you're just picking plastic out of the grass. So you had the bands where you were allowed to operate at the power levels, the low power levels where you're allowed to operate, and you had to share that with medical devices and garage door openers and stuff, because you don't want to be flying your drone in your neighborhood, assuming you're allowed to, and have everybody's garage door opening and closing because you're going to piss people off. So those are known, and the Russians entered the conflict in theory with jammers designed to protect them because they had built their jammers based on the American experience in Iraq, which saw the Iraqis using frequencies for long-range cordless telephones and garage door openers to detonate roadside bombs. So the Russians entered the capability with electronic warfare equipment, but without good instructions, with low-quality manufacturing, with a great deal of corruption where people are siphoning off the electronics, and you get something that looks like a jammer but doesn't function like a jammer, because if you've got a flashlight, you press the slide for a torch, for people that haven't adapted since you had flammable shit on the end of a stick and you set it on fire. So a flashlight, okay, slide the thing forward, you get a light, slide it back, you don't get a light. If you slide it forward, it doesn't work, and you have new batteries in it, you know it's broken. With a jammer, you slide it forward, and what did you get? It looks exactly like it did before you slid the switch. So is it working? Well, I don't know. Did my tank just explode? Damn it. It's not working. So that's a rotten way to find things out. And the other thing is, and you see it in Telegram, and Telegram is essentially Russian social media. And Russians complain about their stuff on Telegram all the time. It's like, yeah, we thought we were jamming the Ukrainians pretty well, but then they switched frequencies on us again. I mean, what the hell? It's like, dude, that's what happens. So it's like any other electronic warfare battle, you move back and forth. You end up spending more money if you want to move out of the commercial band, because again, the video transmitter in there, which I've got, which is NDAA compliant. It's built by a Croatian company called Orca. Why they named a drone racing company after a freaking white and black marine mammal is beyond me, but it's no dumber than any other name. Like Analog Systems, which builds digital systems. So they that video transmitter, uplink, downlink, 7.7 grams, costs $60.
Wow.
But it's in a defined frequency band. So it's not that hard for people to manufacture and say, you know what? The FCC is not going to fine me if I supply the Ukrainians with a chip that works at X frequency. But the U.S. market is going to overprice those things. And so, once again, you'll go to somebody outside that's going to provide you with non-compliant uplink, downlink frequencies. And then you have to change.
Yeah, on that. So this might be another bit of a sort of a nerdy EWO question, and I'm just cognizant of the fact I'm beginning to run out of time. Not to live, but to continue this this conversation. If you want to find the frequency on which someone is transmitting and controlling their drones, and bearing in mind what you've just said, that there could be lots of them, right? But let's say at a in a combat situation, some drones appear. One or two drones appear, and you want to be able to deal with those drones electronically. Is ESM an easy thing to do in that situation? Could you put an antenna up and it figure out, sort of detect those signals and then give you a frequency, and then you can jam it? Is that a simple thing to do? Is that impossible? Is that a ridiculous suggestion? Is that being done? Can you? Oh, he's gone.
Darn it, that didn't work. Okay, so I'm challenged on the visual aid things because I need 3 hands. Okay, and if I whip out 3 appendages, we're not going to be able to publish this. So we're going to use my cranium. So this is a drone. Okay, it's got little sensors. It's flying around. It hears things. This is my this is my drone control unit. Okay, and over here is your spectrum analyzer. Does the spectrum analyzer see the transmission from the control unit? Control unit's got a clear line of sight to my cranium. Does it have a clear line of sight to the spectrum analyzer? Probably.
Yeah, but if your spectrum analyzer, let's say your example, let's say you're in a foxhole, you're, let's say, covered by some trees, you've got a drone overhead, and you've got a little spectrum analyzer on a pole or whatever. Let's say it hasn't been found by whoever's operating the drone. Presumably it does.
The Earth, this may come as a surprise to you, but the Earth is actually a sphere. Okay, and it's got things sticking up all over it. Okay, so it's a line of sight question. Okay. Typically, when you think about jamming, you jam receivers, right? You don't jam transmitters. You jam receivers. Okay. On the other hand, your electronic support measure, your spectrum analyzer, sees transmitters. So if you have a good line of sight to a drone and you're measuring a transmitter from that, you're seeing its downlink. You're not seeing the uplink that goes to it. Yeah, so if you jam in the direction of that particular drone, you're not jamming the uplink because you're not seeing the uplink. You're seeing the downlink, and the receiver is not on the drone. That's the transmitter. That's the easiest way I can say your initial problem is. Now, if you're just looking at spectrum and you're using like an omnidirectional antenna, because directional antennas get big, complex, and expensive, and there's 40 different signals on the air at any given time. Which one belongs to which drone?
Yeah.
So it's easy to think, well, we just, put some sensors out there, but neither side can keep airborne sensors up close to the battlefield because you're dealing with low power signals. Your large coot that's sitting back 240 miles from the front because the last one they got closer got shot. That's not collecting these signals because it is too far back to see things that are transmitting at a watt or a watt and a quarter, because that's all you need to guide a drone out to 2,000 meters. So it's much more complex to analyze the environment and analyze it effectively, especially when it's dense, like in the Vietnam War. And we'll talk about this, when we talk about how to build a new weasel. And you fired an anti-radiation missile, 1966, it was a Shrike. And how many radars were on the air? Not many. How many radars were on the band that Shrike was built to? Well, it was a Russian-built fan-song radar.
Yeah.
And so that missile could go up, and as long as it found a fan song, it just takes the strongest signal, found something in the band, it was probably a fan song. It didn't ID it, it didn't check the address, it doesn't do any of that because it didn't have a library. It just guided on that. Here you're dealing with a wickedly dense environment.
Yeah.
And comm signals are not radars. Right? A radar has a pulse repetition frequency and, a pulse width or pulse diameter, or PRI, depending on which you want to do. And it measures within a frequency band and it tends to repeat itself. Comm doesn't look like that.
No.
Okay, a comm waveform is not a pulsed waveform. It can look a lot like noise. So yes, can you direction find comm? What if you encrypt it? Now it looks exactly like noise. Are these links encrypted? Some of them are. So you end up with a very difficult environment. And so it's not as easy as C signal, jam signal.
Yeah. Are they therefore also asymmetric in that sense as well, that they're simple to operate and use, but very difficult to negate?
Yes, sort of. But realize that just from anecdotal reports, 90% of the drones that hit the air are countered, and most of the presumption is they are countered by electronic warfare.
Really? Okay.
Right, but the operator may not know that. Okay, they know they lose the drone. Did they lose it to electronic warfare? Which part of it was jammed? Did it just fail? I mean, I remember seeing a student project where we lost more little hand-built air vehicles to soldering problems than we did to actually air operations. Okay, does that happen? I'll bet it does. Although I'll bet you there's some dudes out there who are now really freaking good at soldering small bitty pins. And so, when you look at the failure rate, let's assume you see 90% fail. I mean, we know that 90% don't reach their targets, and it's attributed to electronic warfare. It's working most of the time. When you're talking about 2 million drones put in the air in a year, most of the time is not enough to prevent effective battlefield accomplishments by the drones that remain. It's just like watching the videos. We only see the good one. Nobody goes home. The Ukrainian drone operator doesn't go, oh man, I lost 9 drones today. I think I'll post my video. That doesn't happen. It's like, wow, hey, somebody told me where an SA-15 was and I bagged it. Woohoo! Post. So we're seeing the greatest hits tapes and not all the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor in the recording studio because it sucked.
Yeah. Let me ask you then as a closing question. Can we infer then from what you've just said that these sorts of drones are not going to be the sort of game changer, let's say, in a future conflict between, let's say, superpowers, let's say China, Russia, and the States, not China and Russia, but, the US and China or the US and Russia. Let's just, for the sake of hypothesizing, let's take that as an example, that these are not going to be instrumental in the same way as maybe they have been in Ukraine and its dealings with Russia over the last 2-3 years. Does it suggest that with the technical capability, the money, okay, notwithstanding the requirements writing that you've discussed and the ridiculous bureaucracy that goes on, but presumably with some senior generals in the US Army looking at this and thinking this could be catastrophic if it happens to us, we will sort out some solutions that in the future then that will be done and it won't be the issue that it could have been.
Well, that's the way you'd like it to work. So I don't believe in technological game changers. Someday I'll do a class on this. Okay. I don't believe in them, and it's extremely hard to find evidence that they exist. But technological asymmetries are a thing. And so when this is stuff that's as old as warfare, drones are not changing the nature of warfare. And anybody that writes that in a sentence, okay, should just stop writing and take up another line of business. And you know who you are. What they have changed and elements of the conduct of warfare, and that they've brought, like I said at the beginning, precision down to a very low level. If this is an asymmetry, like any other precision munition, if one side can deliver them and the other side cannot, it will be a major contribution to victory. And I'll give 2 air power examples. Desert Storm, which there was a relatively small percentage, less than 20% of munitions delivered were precision, but the Iraqis couldn't deliver any.
Yep.
And then you looked at Allied force, where 90+% of the munitions delivered were precision, and Milosevic's forces couldn't deliver any. So those were huge asymmetries, and they were effectively unanswered. And so small, commercial, cheap, the way I've been putting it is mass is back, because mass can now be matched with precision. And the fact that this is low cost means that you have a deep magazine depth. I mean, if you're buying a missile at $13 million a pop, you can't buy many of them. Okay. If you can buy a missile at $810 in parts, okay, and 3D printer filament, now you can afford to have lots of them. And so the potential for disaster is the same as with any other military force any time in history. When one side has an advantage, if you are unable to match it or counter it, then that advantage is likely to be persistent, and it could be decisive. But it might not be. For all the damage that U-boats did in the Second World War, they were not decisive. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies, and yet the submarine in the Pacific was decisive. Okay, American long-range submarines were decisive because where the Kriegsmarine could not strangle England, the U.S. Navy's long-range submarines did strangle the home islands. You want to know how much sugar and rubber made it from Indonesia to Japan in 1944?
None?
0.
Really?
And the reason behind that was submarines and, to be honest, PT boats and the Far East Air Force. But
wow.
It's one of the weird things I found. This was in the Strategic Air Power Survey, the Pacific Theater after the Second World War, which was amazing number of human years to build. And they said flat out, if we'd known the effects that the submarines would have on sinking oil tankers on the industrial capacity in Japan, we'd have started it earlier. So again, that gets you into technology. If one side has it and the other side hasn't, that could be decisive, but it might not be decisive because again, U-boats. Which is why I say I don't believe in game changers, and that's my prime example. But I could come with more if we had a couple other hours, which we don't.
We don't, but we do have one. We do have time for you to ask one question on that then, and I know it's a topic that's so close to your heart and that you love talking about. So game changer F-117.
No.
Opening night of Desert Storm.
So what?
That changed the game, didn't it? Being able to go in. Well, they took out the operations centers, they took out the comms, they took out the Ba'ath Party headquarters, they took out Saddam Hussein's.
What would have happened if it weren't there?
You would have done the same, but it probably would have cost more lives and taken longer.
Would we have lost?
No.
No.
Would
it have taken longer?
But it changed
not
the way you play the game, not the way that not the outcome of the game.
No, it was just adding another piece. It was a different formation. To use an American example, it was a different formation on the football field where I only had one running back. You know, yeah. So not a game changer. It's simply an adaptation. It's a new tool that was put into the mix.
Okay. I wanted to ask you. I was expecting the answer, and I think you've done well for me not to talk about swarms of drones.
Okay, so pet peeve. We'll talk about it later. Swarming is a behavior. Large numbers of drones are large salvo sizes. Enough said on the matter.
Okay, Starbaby. On that cheery note, I've got to call an end to this because I've got to go to bed.
Great, and I thoroughly encourage that, and I'm hoping actually, I'm hoping that we get better ratings than we did the last time I was out here, because, or more accurately, the last time you put me out here, because that was a freaking disaster. As much fun as it was.
You're referencing the Star Wars thing, aren't you?
Yes, and so for all those people out there that haven't seen the Star Wars thing, you really need to go watch that. It's goofy, okay, but there is some information in there, and I need you to raise the numbers because that's just freaking embarrassing. I would still do it again, by the way, with the guys we did it with. I wouldn't change anything.
It was a good crew.
That, I have embarrassing numbers, but whatever. It doesn't affect my life insurance rates, so who cares?
Well, it's a bit of a departure for the channel, really, to go from military aviation that's sort of very firmly rooted in the real, to go to something that is of course, a sci-fi dramatic reenactment.
But it also shows, one, that you don't take yourself too seriously, and we know I don't take myself too seriously. And the other is that we will do stupid stuff for fun. And so overall, I think that's a bonus. I just don't intend to make a retirement career out of it when I retire someday.
And even if you're not into Star Wars, so I would just say two things. Definitely to get a masterclass on BrevityCom and to get some real nuggets of gold around why certain things in BrevityCom are the way they are. That's one reason to watch it, but the other is to look at to watch Potato wearing. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Potato wearing 3 paper plates on his head. Do you remember that? He's very
awesome.
He was very. He's a rocket scientist, I think, or he works on rocket simulation or something like that. Anyway, hey, Potato, if you're listening to this, don't know what your real name is, but Potato is the name he goes by. Anyway, right, look, I do have to go to bed because I've got other things to do. But did you get to itch the military industrial complex? Did you get to scratch the military industrial complex itch enough?
Too much, yeah. That's why I had you wave so that you could mark it. So this next 9 minutes is really boring.
I'm tempted just to keep that in, so people know how we work. So
I expected you would, but I expected you would because you would just simply be too lazy to edit it out.
That's true. Normally it's because
I'm wrong. You're under time pressure. You got to have that out in 5 days. You're not going to edit that stuff out. Come on. I set you up.
And usually I'm an hour in. I've had a couple of drinks and I can't even remember it by the time I get to editing it. Oh, but one thing I did forget and that you reminded me of, which I should tell the audience, is F4G. No, not F4G. Well, kind of, F4G was the last wild weasel. There's been some discussion on Discord. And people will be saying, what about F-16CJ? Go on Discord and you'll get a masterclass in the definition of wild weasel and not wild weasel by Starbaby in text form. That is on our Discord channel. He posted a lengthy description because there was a lot of interest in that. But it prompted a question about designing the next dedicated true wild weasel platform, let's say. And so what you reminded me of in this call was that we agreed that we would do that as another episode. So I'd said at the beginning of this thing 2 hours ago, we've got 6 Starbaby episodes coming up in the next 2 months or so. And it sounds like we'll end up with 7 in the next sort of 3 or 4 months or so. So everybody at home, I hope you've enjoyed this. I've found it very interesting. Starbaby, thank you, as always, for delivering your insights and your expertise on the subject of drones this time around, and I'm looking forward to getting back with you, talking to you about Ground Tour Part 2. But if I'm really honest with you, what I'm most excited about doing is getting back with you and talking to you about light attack. That's the thing I'm most looking forward to. So, but thank you for joining us.
And Hanky's a stud. There are very few guys I would actually share a screen with on any subject. So just the fact that I even suggested that should tell you I have a pretty high opinion of Hanky Cunningham.
Yeah. So some people ask me just before I hit stop here. Someone would say to me, "Oh, you did your Strike Eagle panel, but you didn't have Starbaby." And I know how Starbaby feels about panels. So if I thought Starbaby that you'd have said, "Yeah, I want to be on that panel," I would have invited you. But I thought you'd probably say, "No, it's not for me." So
you were correct, and I would have obfuscated the whole thing by saying, "No, give me some else time. Give somebody else some screen time," which is Starbaby's way of saying, "Fuck, I don't want to do that."
all right, okay. Thanks so much again. Appreciate it.
Sure. See ya.
Cheers.